Help! I'm polar!
We don't vibe. Your Lipid AP Bio 1.5 note disclaimer.
Before we talk about that little video you just saw, let's talk about this macromolecule summary. Remember, there is a macromolecule out there, and that macromolecule looks a little like a giant molecule that basically is composed of little molecules, which end up becoming what are called polymers. So macromolecules are composed of polymers, which contain different building blocks. And we talked about carbohydrates before, which has a building block of monosaccharides. If you haven't seen our video related to carbohydrates, make sure to check section 1.4. In the macromolecule summary, please note that each one of these macromolecules has their own individual section as it relates to AP biology, specifically in Unit 1. We're focusing in on lipids, and lipids are a fancy way to say that we store energy. We're going to talk more about the details in just a second, but let's also focus on this more detailed summary table, which focuses more on the structure and comparison between those macromolecules. Previously, in carbohydrates in section 1.4, we talked about the idea that they're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids have the same three elements, but they often have phosphorus as well, and they're considered hydrophobic. That's why in the video that you just saw, you saw that water molecule running for its life, saying that it is not a vibe as compared to oil. And that's because oil and water don't mesh. Imagine if you add oil, which is a type of lipid, and you mix it with water. Oftentimes, if not always, it doesn't mix together unless there's something in addition in there. And so oil and water will not mix together. And that's because lipid is hydrophobic. It is a vibe, just like our water molecule has said. Now, carbohydrates, if you remember, have glycosidic bonds. The difference is that lipids have what are called ester bonds, which we'll focus more in just a second. Now, let's dive into understanding a little bit more about lipids here. So if we talk about lipids in terms of structure, it's really hard to distinguish because they could look very different. One of the key things you want to look for is not having that C6H12O6 or 1 to 2 to 1 ratio that previously existed for carbohydrates. Here's the thing. The lipids are not true polymers, so they lack that repeated fissure or feature that you see mostly in carbohydrates, and eventually we'll talk about proteins as well. Instead, they're composed of those three elements that we talked about, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as you can see in these two diagrams here. However, there's no correct way of saying that they're all composed of that. That's why we say mainly. So if there's ever a question where it asks you to distinguish the difference between a lipid and a carbohydrate, no, the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio is steady and strong for carbohydrates. However, for lipids, you can see the structure is just so wonky. For example, we have this little R here that designates some sort of attachment. So it really can be anything. So just be aware of that. One of the key things that you're looking for in lipids is the understanding that they're hydrophobic due to their nonpolar covalent bond. And so they don't mix very well with our water, just like we saw with our little video there. The water molecule is running as far away from its friend, oil. Really quickly, I want to sway you away from thinking negative thoughts about lipids. I know the terms fats can scare you, but one of the type of lipids are called fats, and oftentimes we think about fats causing blood vessel related issues, such as clogging our arteries because there's just too much in us. Well, fats can be beneficial because they provide long-term energy storage. I want you to think about when you're walking around. If it's really cold on a really cold day, you can remain warm because you have enough insulation due to those fats. Next, let's talk about the second most important lipid, aka phospholipids. Phospholipids are so important because they provide a barrier to allow for things to enter and exit the cell on the outside. It's what we call the phospholipid bilayer, and there is a whole unit dedicated to this, aka the cell unit. So hang tight, we'll review some things about the bilayer in this video, but you can also find information at a later time. Also, let's talk about steroids. I know the media gives it a bad rap.
Oftentimes, you think about that bodybuilder who has abused steroids to get them to the point as an athlete to perform overcapacity. Well, when we talk about steroids as it relates to lipids, you're talking about hormones that you naturally find in your body, such as testosterone and estrogen. Yes, you can abuse and also give yourself more testosterone and estrogen as it relates to hormone abuse. However, normally you have these in your blood and they can regulate communication amongst different parts of the cells in long distances, and you have a whole unit dedicated to cell communication. You could think of how a sperm penetrates into an egg. That process itself is dictated by hormones. So the reason why you and I are here today is because there has to be some sort of hormone that was involved at some point in time. And also, I want you to think about cholesterol, which is also a type of steroid. I know it gets a bad rap because you shouldn't eat too much cholesterol, but it also is a key component to the cell barrier. And so I want you to think about that when you're thinking about steroids. Lastly, let's talk about waxes. You often think of waxes as something in your candle or a lotion that has a waxy consistency. Well, think about your plants that have that same lotion on the outside. When water is poured onto that plant, it doesn't really sulk or soak up that plant. Instead, it just lays safely on the outside like a barrier. And that's the purpose of waxes. It's perfect to ensure water safety. It also is utilized in planktons or other organisms as a way to store energy, and it stores it in the form of waxes.
All the ladies love me. I'm unsaturated fats.
Pick me!
Pick me. Pick me. This won't be easy.
Let's talk about different types of fatty acids, not to be misconstrued with the term fats. Now, when we're talking about this idea of lipids, remember we talked about four main categories. And within three of these main categories, you'll notice that they have what are called fatty acids. So fatty acids are within the lipids, three out of the four of them. The one it doesn't contain is what's called steroids. These fatty acids can be further broken down into what's called saturated fats versus unsaturated fats. Saturated fats have no double bond. They usually come in this linear line shape. So they usually are a straight chain, which basically means they tend to be solid because they're packed together. They don't have any sort of movement because there's so much fit in there. And therefore, that allows it to become solid at room temperature. If you ever need to remember saturated fats, think single bonds. So single begins with an S, so does saturated fats, which leads to solids, S. So SSS, that's how I remember it. And if we're taking a look at unsaturated fats, we're looking at one or more double bonds, which could be subcategorized into monosaturated fats versus polyunsaturated fats. When we're talking about monounsaturated fats, I want you to look at the root word mono, meaning one. So it has one double bond. So essentially just one double bond like the picture you see here. If you have polyunsaturated bonds, they usually are two pairs of double bonds. So polyunsaturated fats have two or more double bonds. You could usually find them in omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Now, you might notice the term omega-3 and omega-6 when they're usually talking about eating fish, which is considered to be really good for you if eaten within the right consumption. Just as a disclaimer, nothing can be great. You can't just say that eating too much of a fish is going to be good for you, but overall, it is in general really good to have omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids because they have the positive benefits of a heart healthy fat, lowering your bad cholesterol, improving your blood flow, and fighting off inflammation, which is great for boosting the brain, heart, and immunity overall, especially with omega-3s, which is why our guy unsaturated fat was literally trying to share his rose for the brain, heart, and immunity. And if we're talking about the structure of unsaturated fats, remember we have those double bonds. Let's talk about the hydrogens themselves. The hydrogens can be either on different sides or they can be on the same side. If they're on the same side, they're considered cis, and if they're on different sides, they're considered trans. Oftentimes, unsaturated fats are considered liquids, and they have a tendency to be kinked, which basically means they have that bend due to that double strand. So because the double bond tends to kink, this prevents the tightly packed structure that you see in saturated fats. So instead, it's trying to think of a person trying to lay out on the couch. You want more room to spread out everything. That's the same thing that you're seeing when it comes to double bonds. And so that contains it in a liquid format, like olive oil.
Popcorn?
I don't think this date is gonna work.
I don't want to get fat.
Well, I could have kept you warm.
Let's talk about our friend fats, aka triglycerides. Now, with fats or triglycerides, there is a similar structure. Firstly, there is a glycerol. And if you're wondering what a glycerol is, it is this structure that you see here. It also is attached to 3 fatty acids that you see here. Now, if we take a look at the term triglycerides and we affiliate it with the term fats, you can see the term tri meaning 3. So we have 3 fatty acids, and you could see the root glycer for glycerol. So if you ever get confused as to how to look at a structure of fats or triglycerides, you could just look at the word itself and try to break that down. Now, one of the benefits of fats is long-term energy storage, and it allows for cushioning or protection of internal organs and provides thermal solution. As our friend Fat was out on a date with his girl and trying to raise her up, obviously we think of fat as something negative, like we said that it might cause heart-related issues. In excess, that might be true, but as our friend Fat or triglyceride has said, he also can provide warmth. And so fats or triglycerides come with their own pros and cons. So it's a fine balance between eating too little or too much.
I'm phospholipid. I can't decide if I'm hydrophobic or hydrophilic.
Okay, let's talk about our friend phospholipid. So phospholipids are very unique in their shape. And just like we just saw in that video, phospholipid was going through a very interesting identity crisis. See, the thing is, the shape of phospholipid is very unique as compared to other lipids because it has a hydrophilic head, which means that it's water loving, and then a hydrophobic tail, which means that it's water fearing. The phospholipid is unique because it contains a phosphate in its head. It also has a glycerol, and it contains 2 fatty acids. Sometimes you'll see a picture with a kink in it, and that's due to double links that are formulated in its shape that allow for that kink. The purpose of the phospholipid is to form what's called a phospholipid bilayer. So essentially you could see one phospholipid here and one phospholipid here, and it's unique because they're facing each other. What happens is if you have a membrane or a cell, the outside of the cell essentially contains this phospholipid. And the unique property of allowing it to be hydrophilic and hydrophobic is very unique because if you take a look at a picture of a cell, or if we have a cell, the outside of the cell has to be in a water-based environment, which basically means that the hydrophilic portion of phospholipids has a purpose of shaping outward on both the sides so that way it can be water-loving. The inside is water fearing, which means that if you have something that passes through that phospholipid bilayer, it will pass through pretty quickly with ease because if it likes to be in a water-loving environment, it's not going to want to remain in that center portion. So there's a rush to get to the other side. So we'll talk about this more in other units, but for now, you just need to know that the phospholipid bilayer is formed with these phospholipids. They have a very unique shape, and due to the unique shape, it allows the cell itself to regulate what comes in and out of the cell. Now, the phospholipid bilayer isn't that simple. I just want to note that as a disclaimer, and you'll talk about this in further details in later units. But for now, just know that the bilayer is formulated in such a way to allow things to enter and exit with its unique shape.
I win!
Estrogen here with R.
Test the... This is rigged.
When we think about steroids, we often think about the bodybuilder that has ended up abusing synthetic steroids, when in actuality, steroids are hormones like estrogen and testosterone that are actually naturally produced in your body. The shape is a ring or rings for ring structure, or just looking for rings, and a lot of them should be a key indicator for steroids in general. So when we think of steroids, we understand that they're lipids. And when we think of steroids, you need to rethink in your mind that you're thinking of hormones, which include estrogen and testosterone and cholesterol. You should know that cholesterol is very important. It is a molecule that is found in animal cell membranes, and it's used to produce things like vitamin D, and we need it because it creates bile, for example, and it's also considered, most importantly, used as a precursor, which I'll explain in just a moment. I know when you think about cholesterol, you often think about bad cholesterol, but cholesterol is needed in our body because it allows for fluidity and stability across various temperatures. Now, when we think about cholesterol in terms of the little clip, who won the race? Was it cholesterol? Was it estrogen? Or was it testosterone? And you'll see that cholesterol won the race. And that's because in terms of cholesterol, estrogen, and testosterone, cholesterol acts as the building block from which estrogen and testosterone are then synthesized in reality. And it's used by what's called enzymes. And I want you to remember this word enzymes because for AP biology and college biology, we've noticed in past exams that there has been a really big emphasis on enzymes. So just remember, if you want to increase your ability for estrogen or testosterone, you need to start off cholesterol first to allow for estrogen and testosterone to come through. So I want you to think in your mind, who won that race? It was actually cholesterol, and they are a precursor to hormones and things like vitamin D. Now let's take a look at our second character. So our second character was called estrogen. And estrogen is typically a female sex hormone that's responsible for female sexual and reproductive development. You can think of very female features like breast development, bone health, etc., etc. It can impact certain types of drives. And also, just so you're aware, while estrogen is primarily found in females, it can also be found in males as well. It affects male reproductive health as well. So don't think of estrogen as just being primarily in just females. It's just mostly in females. So what I mean by that is you can find estrogen in males. It's just not a lot as compared to females. And in vice versa, when we think about testosterone, we're thinking about the natural male sex hormone that essentially deals with male reproduction and male maintenance of male characteristics. So it's important that the two work together in both male and females for growth, development, and reproduction. We also want to hear about this word cortisol. You might have seen it in TikTok videos where they're talking about cortisol face. And the thing is cortisol helps regulate stress. So you might see these video clips where if you have increased cortisol, you might notice like a pudgy face structure, big belly, et cetera, because your metabolism has decreased because increase in cortisol. And therefore, you can think about it that sometimes when you have increased cortisol, you have decreased immune response. So they all work together. And you'll talk about this more in the enzyme section, where you realize that a lot of these different hormones are related to one another. So if one goes up, the other one goes down. If one goes up, another one goes up. Or if another one goes down, another one goes down. And it's assisted by what we call enzymes. So keep that in mind when you're reviewing other units as well. Overall, steroids support homeostasis and metabolic functions. Now, I want you to remember that video clip there when at the very end, when testosterone was mad because he didn't win the race. What ended up happening to him was he actually ended up wearing estrogen. He had a pink outfit. And that's because if you notice, when people take synthetic steroids, their hormones tend to fluctuate. So what ends up happening, for example, is if you're trying to boost testosterone, you'll end up decreasing estrogen or vice versa in a synthetic fashion. So oftentimes male athletes who do take steroids will oftentimes have something called male pattern baldness, where they have a tendency to be bald due to the idea that they took synthetic steroids, or they might have female characteristics like breast development, and that's because you're disrupting the normal flow of hormones, and this can lead to development of breast tissue in men. So that's why at the end, testosterone ended up wearing the pink jacket that estrogen wore. So hopefully that helps you remember the relationship between estrogen, testosterone, and the idea of cholesterol actually starting this all off.
Let's talk about waxes, the final lipid to talk about. When we talk about waxes, you often think about something like a candle, but what we think about waxes really has to do with leaves and protection. So I want you to think about the time when you have spinach and you cook spinach, it sort of wilts down. It sort of takes out the water, and if you boil water, it's going to sort of disintegrate or sort of turn into a fashion that lets it be known that it's no longer in the ground. And the reason why the consistency of spinach that's cooked and this leaf right here are so different is because of the wax. The wax on this leaf provides a barrier, and that's because it's water fearing. It's nonpolar and it repels water. And because of this, it's hydrophobic, which means that it fears water to essentially reduce water loss in plants. And when things like rain occur, the rain isn't going to hurt or harm the plant itself. Now, when we think about waxes, we typically think of them as solid at room temperature. For example, if you see this candle here, it's burning and it's melting that wax, and that's because it's no longer at room temperature. I also want you to note that when we're talking about waxes, we can also think of them as energy storage. For example, animals like plankton, which are surrounded by liquid, have a tendency to store energy in the form of waxes.
For AP biology or college biology, it's important that you understand the following summary here. Now, while this doesn't include everything that we talked about lipids, making sure to understand the key differences and similarities when it comes to the different types of lipids is really crucial. While we didn't talk about the specific foods as it relates to unsaturated fats, making sure to understand the differences between saturated and unsaturated fats is really important. You might get a free response question that asks you to compare the similarities and differences. For the first time ever for AP Biology, there is a whole section dedicated to lipids, which means that they probably are trying to get you to understand more specifics as it relates to the general health for free response questions or multiple choice questions. Let's take a look at a quiz question that you potentially could see to help you assess your understanding and knowledge. Take a moment, pause the video, and make sure to unpause once completed. Okay, so in this question it says, what structural characteristic distinguishes saturated from unsaturated fatty answer? And the correct answer is C, presence of double bonds. The reason why this is if you remember, we said saturated equals single. So single bonds for saturated and unsaturated are those double bonds. And the way that I remember it is saturated single. Also remember the other key characteristic is that saturated equals solid. So you want to think of those items like having butter versus oil. This is just a reminder to note that when you're getting questions like this, to not only understand the similarities, but the differences, because you probably will be receiving free response questions that asks you to understand the similarities and differences between the two. Hope this helps.
Appreciate you riding along for our cosmic journey. If today's mission brought you the knowledge that slaps, make sure to hit that like button to boost that signal. Subscribe if you're locked in for our next launch. And don't miss the link tree. It's got all the goods for AP Bio, PSAT Math, and FSAT Math. Before I sign out, make sure you're all in one orbit and diving in. Killing out. Till next time.